Just going to introduce it, I don't know, to a couple sentences.
Neil, you want to look out this way more?
Go ahead.
I'm Alan Brodsky, and the History Committee, chaired by Sid Porter, has given me the honor of interviewing my friend and former colleague and supervisor, Dr. Niel Wald. Dr. Wald is a former president of the Health Physics Society, and we're going to go through his life, his interesting life. And this is June the 27th, 1999, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, at the 44th annual meeting of the Health Physics Society. Now, Dr. Wald, you have had such an interesting life and career with many achievements and honors. I imagine that viewers of this video interview in the Health Physics Society archives would like to know about your early development, including your family or other influences that led you into this career. Can you tell us about them?
Well, I'll be glad to summarize. I was attracted to medicine as a kid. I think I must have been 10 or 11 years old. I had an uncle, a favorite uncle, who was a physician, and he had a patient named Paul de Kreef who wrote a book called Microbe Hunters. And when I read that book, I was hooked. From then on, I was focusing on getting into medicine. But I had no particular relationship in my mind to the field of radiation. That was done by a computer in the Pentagon. I went into the Air Force after I finished my internal medicine and hematology training, and the Korean War came along, and my field had some attraction to the Air Force, and in particular, it turned out I was assigned to the Department of Radiobiology in the School of Aviation Medicine. And that's how I chose to do radiation research and health physics.
The School of Aviation Medicine was where?
At San Antonio, or near it, at Randolph Air Force Base. I was very fortunate to work under Colonel John Pickering, who was not only a navigator, but also a physicist. And we learned a lot from him and from his colleagues.
Well, maybe you could tell us more about your college and medical school experiences and things you remember from there as you went through this very difficult period of study. Maybe it wasn't so difficult for you. What influences do you remember from those graduate years and medical school years?
Alan, actually, it went by so fast. I was one of those who moved very rapidly through the educational process. The idea during World War II was to get people into medicine before they were old enough to be pulled out by the selective service system. So I entered college at Columbia when I was 16, and by the time I was eligible for the draft, I had already done a complete bachelor's program in a year and 9 months at Columbia, and I was already in the first year in medical school. There was a real problem during the war because initially there were no deferments for pre-meds, and all of a sudden the military discovered that the pipeline had a big gap in it, and one of the ways of dealing with that gap was to rush us through before the draft boards pulled us out of the educational stream. So, as I say, it went by so fast that I can't tell you anything too memorable except perhaps taking the whole organic chemistry course 8 hours a day for a month because our professor was about to be drafted, and a few things like that. It was an unusual period in academia.
I can imagine. I took a year of organic at Hopkins.
Yeah.
Going back, were you in medical school? What's medical school? You went to Columbia undergraduate?
Undergraduate in NYU.
NYU. So you were close to home.
College.
Your family was in the area, huh?
Yes.
So at least you had that.
I was born and bred third generation cliff dweller in Manhattan.
Did you live at home when you went to school?
Part of the time I lived on the campus at Columbia, and in medical school I lived near the medical school.
And I imagine, I think I remember your father was a judge, was he?
He was an attorney, and a state senator.
And your mother?
She was involved with philanthropic organizations and educational. She was the president of the PTA at our elementary school when the principal caught me playing dice with another classmate and reported it to the president of the PTA, to her embarrassment. But she was a Barnard graduate. A number of my family had gone to Columbia, one or another school.
And what city were you born in?
Manhattan,
Manhattan.
New York.
That's all very interesting. We could go into a lot more of that if we had time, I'm sure. How about your time in the service? Where were you stationed and what were your assignments?
Well, I went through the basic medical officer course at Gunter Air Force Base in Alabama, and I had already been assigned to the School of Aviation Medicine. So I went on down to Texas, and that was my first exposure, you might say, to the field of radiation and all its problems. My first temporary duty as soon as I got there was to carry some classified material and information to Alamogordo, to White Sands, and I saw the Trinity site, and I had a lot of work at Oak Ridge National Lab and Los Alamos. I was involved in the above-ground weapons tests out in Nevada also. It was quite fascinating. I ran into some interesting people. I remember in particular, as a brand new medical officer and practically a brand new physician just out of my residencies, I was talking to some people at Los Alamos, and one was Jim Brennan. He was a lieutenant colonel, and Major Payne Harris. And I think Wright Langham was with us, and these three guys were talking very sophisticated physics of neutrons and thermals and fast neutrons, and I didn't really have a clue to what that was all about. And I thought, well, these are the physicists, and I'm not supposed to know that stuff. Then I discovered that Jim Brennan was a physician and Payne Harris was a physician, and I thought, I'll never make the grade. How could I possibly get all this education in? But they were certainly people to respect. I respected them.
Yeah, Wright Langham was a physiologist.
Yeah, right.
Oh, you've met some great people in your lifetime, and you've become one of them.
Well.
I remember your early paper in the journal Science describing the observation of increased leukemia among the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I also know that you did work in Oak Ridge, studying the blood picture of animals that were exposed to high levels of radiation. And somehow you correlated that, and you prepared a way of diagnosing and prognosing the scenario
radiation
of
injury.
Radiation injury. And then you used that on a human patient later that had a twin brother, identical twin brother, and you successfully saved somebody's life by that bone marrow transplant. That's a long chain that I've asked about, but it's an interesting chain, and it's a unique chain, and maybe you could go into how that ties together. I've never really heard you tell me how that really ties together.
Well, in my educational experience in the Air Force, I met some very respectable people in the field. We had, as consultants to our department, people like Dr. Bill Ham, Medical College of Virginia, who did all the work on radiation cataracts. Another was Dr. Shields Warren, the preeminent radiation pathologist who became head of the Division of Biology and Medicine of the Atomic Energy Commission. And I didn't realize the connection between a young lieutenant who worked at the same place I did, and we got to be friends. His wife and my wife were fairly new acquisitions for both of us. And one day, my wife told me that Emily, her friend Emily, had mentioned that her father was coming down for a visit. Just about the same time, Shields Warren was coming down to advise us in the Department of Radiobiology. And it turned out that Emily's father was Shields Warren. And nearing the end of my tour of duty, I spoke to him, or he spoke to me, about the future in this field of radiation studies, and suggested that I go over to Japan.
So you went over as a civilian?
I went over for the National Academy of Sciences as soon as I left the Air Force.
So you were in the Air Force for a 3-year term, was it?
A little over 2 years.
1950,
Well,
was
I was
it?
in the reserve for while I was a resident for 3 years, and then active duty for 2 more.
Was it 1950 to 53, something like that?
52 to 54.
You were actually on active duty
I was on
at
active
Los Alamos,
duty,
or in
at Randolph.
Randolph,
but working
with the
primarily at Los Alamos,
Los Alamos.
and Nevada and Oak Ridge.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went out at Shields Warren's behest. He was sort of a father figure of mine. Headed up the hematology studies at the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. And
That's quite an experience for a young man to head that up.
Well, it was.
I guess you had other physicians from Japan working for you and so on?
Yeah, we had, it was a joint, and still is a joint study of the Japanese National Institutes of Health and the US National Academy of Sciences. And it was supported, the US participation was supported by the AEC. When I got there, I realized that the radiation studies were all focused on the illnesses associated with radiation exposure. And being a hematologist, leukemias were an important part of my work. But I missed the dose part of the dose-response relationship, which I had learned about in my experience in the School of Aviation Medicine. So I got in touch with some of the people that I had worked with at Los Alamos and Oak Ridge. And then Oak Ridge, a team came over to Japan and evaluated the possibility of collaborating in the dosimetry studies. When I got through in Japan, I came back to Oak Ridge to participate in the Japanese dosimetry studies that John Hawksier and in K.Z. Morgan's division were carrying out.
Were you then employed by Oak Ridge National Laboratory at that point?
Yeah, I worked for in the Health Physics division.
But when you went to Japan, you were employed by the National Academy of Sciences.
That's right.
And you were there for what, 2 years?
Actually, we went for 2 years and stayed for 3. Japan was just a fascinating experience. The culture, the science, all of it. And so we stayed for 3. And by then we had a couple of young children. We decided maybe it's time to get back to America.
So your boys were both born in Japan?
Yeah.
Did Lillette enjoy Japan also?
Yes. Well, it was an interesting experience. She was, we were relatively newlyweds, and our first child was born less than a year after we got there. She learned the Japanese art and calligraphy and the music. She played the koto, that sort of a long log that's a harp with been any strings. I played the shakuhachi, the bamboo flute. Had a little problem when we played duets because writing down music was rather new in Japan. It was all taught by ear, and the notation for her instrument was different than the musical notation for mine. And when we played duets, we couldn't agree on who was wrong because neither of us could read the other one's music. The Japanese experience, one interesting thing was that by then Shields Warren was the head of biology and medicine at the AEC, and the AEC then began supporting hematological research on radiation effects.
What year was that? About 54?
Well, that was in the 50s, and there were several conferences supported by AEC, which led to the support of bone marrow transplantation as a potential use in radiation injury. That was how bone marrow transplantation began. And Donald Thomas, who got a Nobel Prize a few years back for the pioneering work in bone marrow transplantation, was supported by the Atomic Energy Commission. So it seemed very fitting when we had a radiation accident near us in Pittsburgh to think about possible use of bone marrow transplantation in a radiation accident. And indeed, it was the first successful bone marrow transplant. We were lucky enough, and so was the patient, that he had an identical twin brother, which avoided or bypassed all of the graft rejection problems that are associated with bone marrow transplantation. So indeed, the circle was closed by the effective use of this technique that the AEC had supported in an actual radiation injury patient.
Well, it looks like your medical decisions were right on target, as I remember, in the 1969 plenary session after I gave a paper on one of our internal accident cases. You announced that Dr. Brodsky has not seen this yet, but my rings and dicentrics and the chromosomes give doses that are in direct proportion to his measured doses, physically.
I think we were generally in good agreement with each other, even though I sat on your doctoral committee.
You were a pretty good boss, pretty good professor. Let's see, maybe we should go on. Oh yeah, who and what induced you to come to Pittsburgh? You brought me into your program in 1961.
That's right.
And you were there in 1958. And at the Graduate School of Public Health, University of Pittsburgh. And I wondered who induced you to come to Pittsburgh and establish the radiation health program after Herman Sember had done some work on it. And then you led it for an amazing amount of time as a department chairman, as I remember, for 30 years, and you were there. You're still there over 40 years.
Right.
As a tenured professor, yeah. And you still look the same as you did 40 years ago.
That's very kind,
You're still
Alan.
just as young at heart.
You sure you don't have any radiation cataracts or anything?
No, good vision.
No, I got there, again, you can see by now that my career is dictated by good fortune and chance. One of a group that was concerned about the future of the Japanese studies was sent over by the National Academy of Sciences, and they were primarily epidemiologists. The concern was that everybody was looking at what to an epidemiologist is the numerator, that is the actual cases of disease, but nobody was defining the denominator, the size and characteristics of the population out of which these radiation-associated diseases were coming. And without the denominator, there's no way to talk about the incidence or frequency of occurrence and whether it's greater or less than a general population. So they sent over a group of eminent public health people and epidemiologists. One of them was a gentleman, a doctor named Thomas Parran, who had been the Surgeon General of the United States. And when he stepped down from that important position, he became the first dean of the Graduate School of Public Health at the University of Pittsburgh. That was 1948. And when I came back from Japan to Oak Ridge, somebody mentioned to him that I was at Oak Ridge. He had met me in Japan, reviewed our program as part of his official function, and decided that he wanted to get me to Pittsburgh.
But you were in Oak Ridge at that time.
Yeah.
And he pulled you from Oak Ridge right to Pittsburgh.
Yeah, Dr. Perrin was a very persuasive gentleman. He was the one who conceived and developed the National Institutes of Health, the NIH. He was the one who dared to mention the word syphilis at a time when nobody talked about venereal disease in public, and he saw the only way to fight it was to face it. He was a very persuasive gentleman, and so I came to Pitt, to the University of Pittsburgh. Found Herman Sember there as part of the Department of Occupational Health, and with Herman's help, we got a big grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, and our program was underway.
I remember now also in addition to your knowing when to administer the bone marrow transplant, at Oak Ridge, in the short time you were there, you published a very fine report, because I remember reading it, which laid out all the symptoms of a disease from high radiation exposure, all the signs of the disease in terms of all the blood counts and white cell counts and red cell counts of the various kinds. And you did all that in a couple of years with animals, right? Did you work with anybody else, or
no,
did you have to do that all yourself?
I worked with George Thoma, a physician in nuclear medicine who actually had been my senior at the School of Aviation Medicine in his military part of his career. And we were both consultants to the Health Physics Division, and we decided that it was time to help those physicians who were possibly facing radiation overexposure cases, and because obviously these were not a frequent occurrence, they were having difficulty in dealing with them. So we devised a scheme, a simple triage scheme, by which one could use certain indicators, blood count changes, symptoms, signs, and recognize radiation injury long before it reached a critical point, and therefore one could prepare adequately to deal with the problems. This was published in 1959, and was picked up over the years by many textbooks, somewhat to my trepidation, because since radiation accidents are such rare occurrences, there wasn't much opportunity to validate the thinking that went into this diagnostic model, you might call it. Recently, we began some investigations which will be reviewed at this meeting of the Health Physics Society on a group of nuclear industry workers in the former Soviet Union. The MIAC workers worked at the first plant that produced the first reactor for the continent of Europe. It produced nuclear weapons for the former Soviet Union, and it is still a weapons producer among other activities. And we're doing a study of the MIAC workers. We based our 1959 paper on about 22 radiation injury cases on which there were enough details in the medical literature, including some accidents at Oak Ridge. We now have a group of 59 or 60 cases from the Soviet Union, and we are again validating on that group of workers the triage scheme which we devised back in 1959.
And
that's a current project.
And it's coming out, looks like it's coming out about on track from what you
well,
extrapolated from.
I can't say at this point. this is a collaboration, and our Russian colleagues and we have agreed that
Oh, yeah.
our results
Certainly.
have to be mutually agreed upon.
Yes. But going back, you did some animal experiments that, to model the time changes of
We
these.
did a lot of work with rhesus monkeys.
Rhesus monkeys, was that in Oak Ridge?
No, that was in the Air Force.
In the Air Force. You were involved with that?
Yeah, but the monkeys were actually exposed in Nevada at Los Alamos and at Oak Ridge.
Oh, you must have been involved with Payne Harris then there,
Yeah.
a little bit.
Right.
With that, collaborating with them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's how I
you
met
did use
Payne.
some of that data too, didn't you, in trying to write your
Yeah, it was
ways of diagnosing
all,
triage?
the ultimate purpose was to deal with radiation health problems.
That's a real change from taking animal data in a few years and making it useful for humans by normalizing it to the experience that you did have. That was very good work. Another question, I've been told that your teaching program, I know that your teaching program has produced a number of awardees and well-known people in this profession. And I know that you've been a chairman and a professor, and I've sat in your lectures. So I know you love teaching and you love the academic atmosphere. Can you tell us what you've concluded about what the important elements are of a teaching and research program that brings it to us? To train people that will do you honor when they go forth in the world?
Well, I don't know that I've ever sat down and thought about it. I suppose the thing that's most helpful is to have some idea of where you want to go, or where you want your students to go in terms of professional activities. And if you can keep that in focus, the rest sort of follows. Certainly you need research people, and they have to be enthusiastic about their activities, and they have to understand and be interested in the application. We in a School of Public Health are focused on ultimately the health impact of what we do, and that kind of focus is, I think, very important for an academic program. I'm not saying that a program focused on the physics of radiation is not important, but as long as there is a clear focus and professional goal. Another important thing is to make sure that people that you produce have opportunities for their own future professional career. We've never been interested in producing graduate students for fields where they would not find a useful career when they got through. And so we focused sometimes at master's level training for the people that are at the front line of radiation protection. More recently, with support from the Department of Energy, we've been focusing on attracting people with doctoral level training in other fields into the area of radiation sciences. And we have a 5-year program which began about 2 years ago to grant fellowships and train physicians, other natural science doctoral holders, and I've persuaded DOE to let us also include doctors of jurisprudence, because of my personal view that so much of what we do in the field of radiation protection is not dictated by our scientists and our physicians, but rather the lawyers and the legislators and the judges. So we are going to try to find a doctor of jurisprudence with the interest and enough scientific background to get into the area of radiation sciences. It'll be an interesting experiment.
Sounds important to me, I know that. I've worked with some lawyers, and as you know, when some of my career was in the government. Well, it's really been impressive to me that you formed a department. When I first came with you, we were in the Department of Occupational Health under Dr. Kammerer, a very
Right.
fine man. It wasn't more than a few years, I think, and you were admitted as your own department, like a nuclear particle. And you headed that for, wasn't it 30 years at least?
Oh, at least, yeah.
And now, after 40 years, you're still so active in creating more programs in education.
Well,
how is it to have the stamina and the energy to not only do your research, but to run a broad program like this?
well, for one thing, I guess one of the most rewarding aspects of it is to turn out people who become leaders in the field, such as Dr. Alan Brodsky, for example. This is one of the stimuluses that I think keeps us going. I found that in an academic environment, as needs, professional needs change, you can adapt to them, and so you're constantly have the opportunity to do something useful in your chosen field, and I guess that's what keeps me interested and keeps me going.
Well, we could talk so much more about that, but I'd like to get on to the fact that you also became president of the Health Physics Society. And when I first met you, you didn't consider yourself a health physicist. But not, not long after we both served on the board from 1960 to 70, 1967 to 70, and I was a little worried about running because if I won on the board and you lost, I was a little worried about my job. Fortunately, we both won. We were on the board together, and I think we attended every meeting of the board together. But you went on to do much more, became president, etc. And you were also active in other professions, other professional organizations. What brought you to serve the Health Physics Society with all the other things you had to do as a physician, one of the few physicians, or are you the only physician that was ever president?
I'm the first and up to now the only. And maybe every once in a while I stop and think about that and wonder what I did wrong. But I suppose I got into it because I came back from Japan. I missed the beginning of the Health Physics Society because I was in Japan when it started. But very early on, I was in the Health Physics Division with Casey Morgan, the preeminent leader in the field, and with colleagues like Rufus Ritchie and Sam Hurst and
Jim Turner?
Jim Turner, yeah.
Came in there at that time, before you left, huh?
Right, and Walter Snyder. I could go on. That division was a very inspiring
Incredible
environment.
People. Yeah.
And so I was interested in the field, and some of my colleagues asked me to run, and I was willing to, although I did feel that medical background was not inappropriate for the area of radiation protection. And I still feel that way.
Certainly.
Even if I'm a minority of one. So I was willing to run, and I must say that the year as President-elect was a very educational one for me, going around to the various chapters. There weren't as many then, of course. And with Robley Evans as my mentor, the preceding president, I learned a lot more about the field than I knew when I started. I must admit I don't consider myself a health physicist per se. I still don't have the qualifications that I think a health physicist needs and that I insist on my graduate students acquiring.
Well, great people are modest, I found that.
But, well, I think my biggest achievement for the Health Physics Society actually was signing up Dick Burke to become the executive front office man for the society. Up till then, we had sort of a part-time executive secretary who was great, but he did his bookkeeping on the kitchen table in his home, and our records were always a little confused. And I think it helped to get us established as a really first-rate professional society. So I think that was my major contribution.
That's a great contribution, because it's lasted, and lasted. And
yes,
done us a
I'm
lot of good.
pleased
We keep getting better
yeah.
with that kind of support. Thank you.
Yeah.
And well, after more than 40 years, you've still continued your research and teaching. You spoke a little bit about the postdoctoral fellowship already that you, and your work advising the Russians, or participating with the Russians.
Yeah.
Actually, you're a co-investigator on some of these epidemiologic studies.
That's right.
Can you describe some of the current activities a little bit?
Well, I've, although I started some of these things, I've turned over the principal investigator slot to my younger colleagues who are more capable than I am. And, but I do continue to participate in some of these. The segment of the Russian worker study that I'm most involved in is, as you might guess, the acute radiation syndrome cases. But in addition, there are some other subsets of interest. There's the plutonium pneumosclerosis subset, workers without respiratory protection who worked with plutonium. And a third subset, which we're very interested in, has a diagnosis from our Russian colleagues of chronic radiation sickness. And we're trying to learn more about that, because that diagnosis doesn't exist in our medical system at this time. So it's a very interesting population of workers and ex-workers. Fortunately, all the records were maintained right from the beginning as state secrets, so nobody dared to throw them away. Whereas in our system, you recall the battles that Dr. Tom Mancuso had to convince the AEC to keep those worker records.
Not even to send them to these sites like St. Louis, where they did have a fire and lost something.
Yeah.
Well, that is wonderful. That sounds like you have some really good scientific challenges ahead of you with this new data, human data. And I wish you a lot of success in that kind of endeavor. Can you tell us about your wonderful wife, Lulette, who I understand was, I remember she was trained as a nurse.
Right.
Where you met her, how she has dovetailed so actively with your career.
Well, she was, I met her shortly before she entered Bellevue Nursing School. And
New York?
Yes.
So
Bellevue,
you knew her in New York.
I should say, when I went to NYU College of Medicine, it was an amalgamation of NYU and Bellevue schools of medicine that created it, about 100 years ago. And the main hospital that NYU used as a teaching institution, and still does, is Bellevue Hospital. So she went through the Bellevue School of Nursing, and of course went with me to Japan and Oak Ridge, and used to even come to Health Physics Society meetings. But when I got to be President-elect, there were so many trips, and she had been to so many Health Physics Society meetings, I don't think I've ever convinced her to come to any more of them when I stepped down from the presidency. But she has gone with me. She may be one of the few American women who has been inside the Chernobyl reactor since the accident, for example. She has an interest. She visited Pripyat with me, and the town the abandoned city 5 miles away from Chernobyl. And she maintains her own career as an artist and a writer, and a successful one.
She's also been interested in anthropology, hasn't she?
Yeah,
many intellectual interests.
Right, and East Asian studies as well. She got her training at Pitt, bachelor's and master's in those fields.
Well, now, with so much behind you and a great future ahead, you've already told us a little bit about where you're headed, but would you like to say any more about your plans for the future activities when you join your emeritus professor rank, which I think you're going to do, have the honor of doing?
When my dean allows me to. My department head is currently the interim dean of the school, and I'm not sure which hat he's wearing when he insists that I continue to participate in the academic activities of our department. But some of my colleagues that were with me in the Department of Radiation Health, which then merged again with Occupational Health, so that we're back where we started when I joined the University of Pittsburgh. They are progressing, and Dr. Greg Claycamp, for example, who got his PhD with Herman Sember.
Didn't remember that. Well,
yeah, at Northwestern.
some feedback there, huh?
Yeah, it all seems to tie. If you hang around long enough, a lot of these circles seem to complete themselves, and Greg is now taking the administrative responsibility for the radiation health activities, and is heading up the DOE postdoctoral fellowship program, for example. So I'm moving out of the administrative realm, but continuing my research interests.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Wish you many, many years, maybe decades ahead of enjoyment in your successful career.
Well, thank you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Neil. I hope we'll be able to have a chance to chat with you some more about these things someday.
Well, as I said, one of the most rewarding things is to see the success of my former colleagues and students, and I rank you high among them.
You've added a lot to my career. Thank you.
Well done.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Very